Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a nice 11-game Major League Baseball slate that starts at 7 o'clock. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really does help the channel a lot. We do have some core plays here. Before I get into those, though, can you drop a comment below with your home run calls for today? And then we will get into the slate. The core plays here are Salvador Perez, Josh Jung, and then Michael Harris on DraftKings. Over on FanDuel, we have Jung, Turner, and Harris. Trey Turner, that is, for Philly. So this is an interesting slate. We have a lot of good value, a lot of good pitching. So I've whittled it down, though, some. I am going to start with pitchers. There's actually there's 4 pitchers I really like, and then there's another 5 that are in play. So I'm going to go over the more detailed in the 4, and then I'll give you the other 5 as well. We'll start with Jordan Montgomery for St. Louis. He's got a really good matchup here against Detroit. He's got mid to high upper 20 upside and has nice appeal as a good P2 option. His K rate isn't crazy, but he's very rosterable here in a very nice matchup. Then we'll look at Clayton Kershaw, who's in a big-time matchup here against San Diego. He's been absolutely dominating so far this season against good teams, included. He's had 3 straight games over 25 fantasy points, including 2 over 35. He's got the most upside on the slate. He is priced up at the highest price at $10,800, but it's actually not that terrible considering there's plenty of good options at the value play from the position, so he's definitely in play here. Corbin Barnes, rather. What am I saying? Corbin Burns from Milwaukee is also in play against San Francisco. This game being in San Francisco does help him a lot. His ERA is not great on the season, but he's got decent upside here, and he's kind of a solid P1 or P2 option, depending on how you want to utilize him, if you want to. He's a little bit riskier than some of the other options, but he is viable on the slate. I'm also going to look at Merrill Kelly. He is a contrarian Hail Mary play for GPPs. He's got really good stuff, and he's facing a pretty good matchup here, and I really like the upside here. It's a little bit risky, but he's getting a decent amount of strikeouts in some games, and he's faced a pretty solid slate to start the season, and this easier matchup should give him some opportunity to have a good fantasy day. He's also just super cheap at $6,800, making him a viable play. I'm also going to mention a couple other guys here. We'll start with Cody Senga. Now, he's in a high-risk, high-reward situation here in Colorado. This game's at home for the Mets, so that's a benefit. But he hasn't done particularly great against even some average teams. He has had some good games this season. The earned runs are concerning, but his strikeouts are pretty good, so he's a viable contrarian play. Luis Castillo is also in play for Seattle, but he's got a very tough matchup against Houston. However, Houston's not the same this season as they've been in the past. They're still really good, though, so he is in a tough spot, but he is viable because he's a good pitcher. Max Fried is also in play against a tough matchup against Baltimore. He has been absolutely lights out to start the season, and so he is viable here, but he is a little bit risky since they are one of the tougher teams that he's going to face so far early in the season, but his price makes him viable today. And then Zach Wheeler for Philly, he's also in play. He's a little riskier than some of the other guys I've already mentioned due to his price, but he does have some upside here, though the matchup is not appealing, and there's some Boston players I do think are viable on the slate. And then finally, Javier for Houston, he's also in a kind of a tough-ish matchup, and he does have some boomer bust potential here. But he's faced a pretty solid slate in the last few games, so he definitely has some upside. But he is somewhat risky, but his K rate's good, but he's also likely to have a home run given up. So moving on to our catchers and first basemen. So we really are going to start with Salvador Perez here as our core play at catcher. At $4,300, he's very rosterable. He has nice upside here, home run potential. Everything looks really good for him today. In fact, I like both catchers for this position. However, I'll get to Melendez in the outfield. We'll look at William Contreras for Milwaukee. He's got some really nice upside for this matchup. However, his price is super high, making him harder to roster, but he definitely has some utility here. Then we'll look at William Contreras for St. Louis. He is also Wilson Contreras for St. Louis. He is also in play at the same price as Perez. He's a good contrarian option here. All three guys I've already mentioned have really good upside on the slate. And if you want a kind of a cheaper option, Jonah Heim is in play as a good home run potential option for Texas, and he's got a really nice matchup and has good metrics for the situation. Other player to consider at this position is MJ Melendez. Moving into first base, we'll start with Paul Goldschmidt, who I really like and has nice upside. He's just super pricey and it's going to be somewhat hard to roster. He's not hitting a crazy amount of home runs or anything, and so his price is a little bit unappealing on this particular slate. But he is viable and he's a little bit cheaper than he's been, so he is in consideration. And first base is probably the weakest position on the slate, in my opinion. We'll look at Pasquanto for Kansas City next. He's also got some really nice upside. He's been hitting the ball really well and had some really nice fantasy days, and he's got a good situation here against Miller, and he's got some good upside as a result. Then for kind of a value play here is Dan Vogelbach. He's got some Hail Mary potential here. He's hit the ball decently well and so far this season, and he does have boom or bust potential here, and he's just too cheap to ignore. And some other guys to consider here are Matt Olson, Alec Boom, Otani, and Josh Naylor. All have some utility on this particular slate. Moving into second base, we'll look at Tommy Edman. Now, I really like Tommy Edman today. He can play second or shortstop. He's a top-tier play at either position. However, I do think he's more viable at shortstop, where there's less great options. But he's in play here and has good matchup metrics for this situation. Polanco is also in a good spot here from Minnesota. His price is a little bit higher, but he's definitely rosterable, and he's really started the season off with a bang, and I like his upside in this matchup. We'll also look at Jeff McNeil, who has some really good potential, not really as a home run hitter today, but just as a guy that gets some hits, and he's got some good metrics here, though he's a little bit riskier, but his price is down, which helps you get him in your lineup. And then Matt Duffy is a Hail Mary play, who you can utilize as a high-risk, high-reward option. He's got some interesting upside, but he is high-risk, high-reward, like I mentioned. Then we'll look at Josh Jung at third base. He is a core play today for me. He's got big-time potential here. I really love his upside. His metrics just absolutely jump off the charts today. As you can see, he does sometimes have a lot of 0-point games, but when he has home run potential, which he's really hard not to roster, especially on a slate like this where his price is cheap. Then we'll look at Arenado for St. Louis. The metrics are there, but his hitting has been subpar so far this year. However, he's had a couple hits the last few games now, finally starting to get some fantasy points rolling. And if he can get going, then he's priced cheap enough that he's barely viable as a contrarian play. Austin Riley is a good expensive play at this position, though I'm not sure that he's the most rosterable due to the price, especially when there's a lot of good value plays available, including Alex Bohm for Philly, who's got some nice upside here. Hasn't hit the ball particularly well. I mean, he's just a little bit above what he should be, but he does have some upside here. Now, the question here is how he'll fit in the lineup as with Bryce Harper returning, but he's definitely in play in the slate. Others to consider at this position are Josh Rojas and also Rafael Devers. Moving into shortstops, we are going to look at Trey Turner, who I really like today a lot. He is very expensive, though, and is hard to roster on DraftKings. However, he's almost impossible not to roster on FanDuel due to his cheap price. Tommy Edman can play here as well. Another option here is Javier Baez, who has some interesting upside at this position. He is high risk, high reward due to the matchup, but he does have some upside for Detroit here. Then we'll look at Mikhail Garcia, who... Oh, no, I'm sorry. Then I'll mention for the outfield. I'm sorry, guys, I'm messing up. Mike Trout is my top option for the outfield today. He has the best metrics for the slate in the outfield, though he is very expensive and harder to roster as a result. He does have big-time upside. He also hit a home run in his last game, so I do think he has some nice utility for this particular slate. Yoshida for Boston is also in play today. Even though he's in a tougher matchup, he's had a ton of games in a row with a hit, at least one or two hits. Since the 18th of last month, he has been on a tear. And a lot of these games, he's had more than one hit. And so, you can see a lot of good fantasy output games. His price has come up, but he's definitely viable on the slate. Michael Harris is in a great spot today for Atlanta. He should be back today according to Snickers, so I do expect him to play today, and if he does, he's going to be somebody that you're going to want to have in your lineup at this cheap price. Not only that, but it's not going to stay this cheap for very long, especially once he gets going again. He's a guy that can get stolen bases, he can hit home runs, he's got nice upside and good potential. Corbin Carroll is in play today for Arizona, assuming he comes back. He's hit the ball really well to start the season, and he's got some really nice metrics for this matchup. And if he draws a start, he's definitely going to be a top-tier play. Others to consider as top-tier plays are Byron Buxton and Ronald Acuna. Both those guys are just hitting the ball extremely well. Maybe into the value plays in the outfield, we'll look at James Outman, who has absolutely just killed the ball so far this season. And he's got a very interesting matchup here against Yu Darvish, which really just has my home run buzzer going off. I think he's probably going to try to swing for some fences with this matchup, and I do like the upside for him, even though he does have strikeout risk as well. Castellanos for Philadelphia is very interesting today. His price is a little bit pricey, but he has some good potential. He's hit the ball well, and while the matchup is not super ideal, it is viable as he does have some power opportunity today. Dylan Carlson for St. Louis is in play today. Despite not hitting the ball all that great this season, he does have good potential for some good fantasy days off and on, and his price is cheap enough today that he is a viable option. Then we'll look at MJ Melendez, who I really like today as a kind of a contrarian play in the outfield. He's higher risk, higher reward, but he has some nice utility here, and he's definitely in play as a decent option on the slate. Brandon Nimmo is also in play today for the Mets. He's got a little bit pricier than I'd like him to be, but he's got good potential here, and he's got stolen base potential occasionally. He's also just really good at getting on base. Not so much a big home run hitter on the slate, but he definitely has some upside. Then we'll look at, see here, Miguel Garcia for Kansas City. Now, he has some really good metrics, and he's what I call a top prospect play today. If he does draw the start today, he'll be worth a flyer in some GPP lines. High risk, high reward, but his price is super cheap and helps you pay up for other options. And then finally, Lourdes Gurriel Jr. for Arizona. I really like his upside today, and he's got a good matchup. He's got a good price, and I think he's a very viable option on the slate. Others to consider at this position, Taylor Ward, Jeff McNeil, Robbie Grossman, Tyler O'Neill, and Brent Rooker. Moving on to the FanDuel side of it, really there's four pitchers that we want to take a look at. Jordan Montgomery is my top option, Clayton Kershaw number 2, Zach Wheeler number 3, and then Corbin Burnes number 4 in that order. I think Montgomery is the easiest to roster, being him the cheapest, and he also has a pretty good matchup, but Kershaw is overall the guy with the most upside on the slate. Moving into the catchers and first baseman, we can start with Paul Goldschmidt, who's very rosterable here on FanDuel with his price. He hasn't been hitting the crazy amount of home runs, but he's still getting lots of hits, and that gives him some good upside in this matchup. Then we'll look at Contreras for Milwaukee. He's got some really good metrics for this matchup, and he's got a nice potential and a very plus matchup against a weak opponent. We'll also look at Salvador Perez, who I really like at catcher today, though he's not as ideal on FanDuel as DraftKings, where he's a lot cheaper than Contreras, but he has some nice upside here and has good potential as a good option. Pasquanto also in play today for Kansas City. He has some really good upside in this matchup, and he's hitting the ball extremely well lately. I really like his potential and a good matchup against Oakland. Moving to second base, Polanco was a near must-play for me due to his price and just the fact there's not a ton of great options at second base on FanDuel side of things, but he definitely has some nice utility here and has good potential. I do like Jeff McNeil here as well. He has some interesting upside, and he can play multiple positions too in the outfield, and so he's definitely in play here. A little bit risky, but price cheap. Josh Jung is a guy I think you have to try to roster today. I do think he's going to home run today. He's had some really massive games lately, and while he does sometimes have zero-score games, he also has those gigantic 40 fantasy point games that we like to find. But a good alternative to him is Devers, who's a little bit more expensive, but he's got home run potential every time up, and he's been hitting a lot of them lately. We'll also look at Bohm for Philly, who has some nice utility here. He is high risk, high reward, but he's got a good upside matchup, and so that gives him some viability. Trey Turner is too cheap over here on FanDuel. He is a core play to his price. He has home run potential here, and this is a great matchup against Chris Sale, and so I really like the upside. And then Mikhail Garcia is another guy. He's very Hail Mary-ish today, but he's a good prospect, has great numbers, has stolen base potential as well, and even has a little bit of, good, he's got a good hitting as potential here. So I think he's a great option on the slate. Moving at James Outman in the outfield, I really like his upside today, and his price is really good here on FanDuel. Makes him very viable and very useful on the slate. Trout is super expensive, but he is capable of putting up a home run today. All the metrics scream that, and so I think he's got great upside. Yoshida has been absolutely tearing the ball off the cover lately. He has had great game after great game. He has really good stuff right now. He's hitting the ball extremely well. I really like his upside, and even though it's a tougher matchup, I think he's very viable on the slate. Michael Harris is a core play. He's just way too cheap for his potential here. He has home run potential when he comes up. He also has stolen base potential. I like his upside, and he's not going to stay cheap for long. Castellanos for Philly is also in play. He sometimes, isn't a great option, but at certain situations, he's a great option, and today's one of those days. I really like his upside. I like Philly in general on this particular slate. Dylan Carlson is a high-risk, high-reward play, but he's super cheap and viable on the slate as a result of the price. So he is somebody to consider, but he's not ideal. MJ Melendez can also be a good option in the outfield here for Kansas City. He's got some boomer bust potential here with a good home run upside. Brandon Nimmo is also in play for the Mets. He's got some really nice upside here with his just his pure batting perspective. Don't necessarily feel like he's got great home run metrics today, but he does have the ability to get on base and sometimes steal some bases. And I think the Mets will score some runs today. And finally, last but not least, Corbin Carroll, who looks like he'll be back from injury today, and he has some really nice upside, though his price is not super ideal here. He is viable and is worth taking a look at. So with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments, questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.